I always say you're going to exit your company one way or another. It might be feet first, but
Yeah.
it's going to happen. And then there are going to be things that just help get a transaction done. So you can have actually a great company with great fundamentals, but if you can't tell the story, if you can't demonstrate that well to a potential buyer, they're going to have to factor in a certain amount of uh, price uncertainty because of their uncertainty on really what's going on in the business. That's going to impact price.
Hey, welcome to this week's episode of The Freedom Experience. I'm your host, John Moncrieff, and today I'm talking all about business exits with Bruce Eckfeldt. Bruce is a strategic coach, he's an author, and he's a speaker. He went from architecture and 3D modeling to founding one of the very first agile lean consulting firms, which made the Inc. 5000 for 5 years in a row. And Bruce ultimately went on to sell the business in 2013. So in this episode, we dive deep into the emotional and strategic challenges of exiting a business and why understanding your why is critical before making this giant leap into going through your succession plan or through exiting your business. The other thing we talk about is how to design a roadmap for a successful transition, including assembling the right team to make sure that that transition is successful and preparing your business for a maximum valuation. And then finally, we talk about the importance of planning your next chapter to avoid the identity or exit identity crisis that many founders face, that loss of a sense of purpose when you move on from selling your business as you go into that next chapter of your life. I had a great time recording this with Bruce. He's a fantastic guy. And I love his whole coaching for vinyl program that he's got going. Take a look at that. I'll add some of that into the show notes. But I hope you enjoy this. Let's dive in. Bruce, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for coming on. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. So I thought, like, as a starting point, I know you've gone through the process of building up your own business and going through that exit process. Maybe just a little bit of background about where you come from in your story.
Yeah. And I think it's important because I don't come to this, I think, in a sort of traditional way or a typical way. I went to school to be an architect. I did 2 degrees in architecture at McGill University in Montreal, and ended up kind of getting into architecture. So when I was at school, the computers were kind of coming online as a design tool. And so I was one of the early classes that really got into the computer as a design tool and modeling tool. I was doing a lot of 3D modeling, kind of work early happenings of Form Z was kind of the big application that we had and stuff. But I was really into this kind of computer as a design tool. So when I got into the profession, I realized the profession of architecture was just really not that interesting and not that compelling for me as a kind of a designer and as a builder. And, it wasn't, I saw the next 30 years of my life kind of down the set of cubicles in the office that I was working at. And that wasn't super interesting.
Yeah.
The computers were taking off. I ended up getting recruited to New York to work with interactive media. So it was actually pre-internet. They were doing a lot of 3D modeling and CD-ROMs and touchscreen kiosk kind of things in museums, very high-end museums and things like that. So I got recruited in the design world, and then internet took off and kind of got into software and technology that way. Spent about 6-7 years in consulting and digital kind of business strategy and product strategy, and stumbled across something called extreme programming. Was an early lean agile software development practice. Had an opportunity to work with some pretty amazing people out of Europe that were kind of on the leading edge of some of these kind of methodology approaches. And so we founded a company. I left the consulting group I was at and founded a company doing lean agile software development. And so we did product development, systems development, system integration, legacy migration work, and then organizational change. So we did come into these mid-market technology teams and did big agile transformations. And so I got very into kind of organizational change and organizational design and kind of coaching around that space. We founded back in 2002, sold it in 2013. So I spent a little over a decade being, a founder, CEO, growth company, put that company on the 500 list a couple of times. And I would say the big thing about my exit story was I probably was, I would say, about 3 years too late, in the sense of not so much the business, although definitely we were seeing headwinds in the business and kind of the world had changed over that decade, and we went from being kind of this super cutting edge, no one was doing what we were doing, to be, there are lots of companies that were kind of in the agile space. I would say we were still leader, but it was much more of a developed market. I think for me, it was really more personal. It was, after 10 years, I had kind of lost steam in terms of my interest in the segment and in the business. And, I wasn't a programmer, right?
Yeah.
If I was writing code on a project, something had gone horribly, horribly wrong, right? Like I'm not by nature a programmer. So I think probably about 7 years in, I had a little bit of a existential crisis on like, do I don't really want to run this company for another 10 years. I thought about sort of transforming it. We did some strategy work about becoming more of a product company, and made a couple attempts at doing some product development. Then I wanted to be more of a strategy consulting company. I think in my core, I'm a strategist. So it was how do I kind of how to transform the company into something I want to do, rather than something that was just kind of like, it was successful, but I had the lack of alignment. And I think I spent probably 2 years too long just grappling with that and trying to make things change, and finally kind of realized like I should just sell this and do something else, right? Like I shouldn't try to shoehorn this company into what I want. I created this, great asset that had a future on its own. I can let it go. I can let it go off and do its thing and not feel like I need to kind of run it. I think my ego is very kind of interlaced and kind of wrapped up in it. So I would say that's the biggest thing, right? Like, and I think that's something I come across with a lot of founders, right? Is this kind of how is their ego interlaced into the company, and is that good? Is that bad? Is that problematic? Is it working for them? Is it not working for them? I think that's the biggest thing that I find in this kind of, when you start to think about exiting a company, that's kind of the biggest question that I start with.
You were 7 years in, and you get to the point where you're kind of feeling the itch, and there's a whole lot of things going on there. There's not quite intentional about it. And
I like kind of doing like a 5 to 10 year plan with most CEOs.
Yeah.
Where, we're plotting out kind of an arc for a future that is interesting to them, interesting to the company, has opportunities, has company for the leadership team, right? And then we reevaluate. And I'm a big fan of like kind of tours of duty, right? You don't need to assume that you're going to own this thing forever. And no one should assume that they're going to work at a company forever. But creating some kind of, okay, I've got a plan for some longer period of time that I can create some goals and alignment around, and then I reevaluate.
Yeah. I mean, I think most owners aren't thinking about anything beyond the next few weeks, few months. They're so caught up in the weeds that they're not.
Yeah.
Was that kind of where you were? Were you stuck down in the weeds of this thing, or?
Well, I think we were fortunate. We had done a fair amount of strategic coaching. I think we were pretty good at long-term planning. We had, quarterly rhythms in place. I mean, I had used EOS, I had used scaling up, I had used MAP, I had used strategic coaching. I went through kind of all the different frameworks. I think I had lots of tools for the kind of practical aspects of planning and strategy. Yeah. I think what I was missing was more of the personal strategy and the personal kind of assessment of what do I really want from this company ultimately. Because in the beginning, you're kind of chasing money. It's like, hey, this is my job. You're chasing, it's financial. I just got to grow, right? Like that's just sort of the obvious immediate thing in front of you. And then at some point you kind of ask the why questions. And that's where I think, in this kind of 5 to 7, 10 year time frame is where a lot of founders, CEOs end up having this kind of question that come up. And sometimes it's very pronounced and they're really grappling with it. Sometimes it's just kind of like you hear a little squeaky wheel and it's like, there's something else here that's more than just, hey, can we double this business in the next 2-3 years? Okay. Why? Like, what do you want to get out of it?
Is that where you're starting with owners when you start talking to them? This why?
Yeah, it somewhat depends on where I am. I mean, sometimes, I'm coming into situations where there's a little bit of crisis and they're dealing with, a lot of change and we just kind of have to stabilize. We're just kind of, okay, like, let's sort things out. Like, where is the real opportunity? Where are we just kind of chasing our tails? Let's kind of get a clear business model. Let's get a clear set of differentiators. So I'll often come in and just kind of clarify strategy, and that will help kind of create some alignment. And okay, this is where we're going. I get it.
Got
But
it.
pretty quickly after that, there's kind of this, okay, why? Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to do this as a leadership team? Why do you want to do this as a founder, particularly on the founder side where it's, still privately held and, they have control. And, if they're venture backed or they've got, cap table with a whole bunch of investors and everything, it's a little bit more like, okay, look, we need to exit this thing in the next 3 or 5 years. We need to return capital, et cetera. But oftentimes we're getting into these questions pretty quickly about, yeah, we could double, triple, quadruple this company in the next couple of years. Is that what you want? This is kind of, what is the motivation here? Because it's hard, right? The fact is this kind of growth stuff is really, really hard. And if you haven't really figured out your motivation stack, right? Like, why do you want to do this? And why is this valuable? What is the impact you have? And typically, in the beginning it's, oh yeah, financial, resources. Okay, great. But what are you going to do with the financial resources? Or what do you want to do beyond financial resources? What is the impact you want to have on yourself, your family, your community, the society, right? Like, it starts becoming a little bit of this why question. And I find that is an important one to grapple with before you can really start answering questions of how we're going to exit, when we're going to exit, for how much are we going to exit, all those mechanical things. You kind of have to start with this. What is the motivation here?
Because there can be triggers. I mean, divorce, disability, disagreement with partners.
Yep.
I've been working with somebody recently where just gone through a divorce and wife takes the house, which is paid off. And I think the owner's now looking at the business, which is an asset, and saying, how do I increase the value of this asset? What I do with it, I hadn't really thought about it this way before. And
well, I've been in, I've been in situations where the divorce hasn't happened yet. And, the business owner is like, oh, I don't want to create too much of an asset here, right? Like, there can become really, kind of skewed and complicated motivations of going on, or we want to create the kind of potential, but not actual profit or something like that. So yeah, there's all sorts of craziness that happens when you really kind of get into what's driving people's decision making. And yeah, there's often, that's why one of the first questions I asked with an owner when we kind of get into this, okay, we're going to scale, we're going to exit, it's like, why? Like, I mean, is this, I'm going through, there's a series of external events. I have to de-risk my situation, or, it's easier for me to sell this thing so we have real assets that we can divide up, or partnership disputes, or like all these things. If those are the cases, okay, great. Let's get those on the table and let's figure out what is the best, most efficient, maximal way to kind of deal with that situation. Or if they're, no, I really have no interest in selling this thing anytime soon, then it becomes much more of like, okay, well, I always say you're going to exit your company one way or another. It might be feet first, but it's going to happen. There are things we can do to just make that easier to do if and when it comes up. There are some things we can do strategically, given what we think an exit might be. If we have ambitions of passing this on to another generation, if we're going to pass it on to employees, that's very different than if we're going to go to market in the next 2-3 years. We would want to focus on and kind of structurally design things a little differently depending on those types of outcomes.
Yes, I guess depending on the type of, going back to your why and your purpose, is this something we want to turn into kind of an ESOP, completely employer-owned, versus trying to find a strategic acquirer? And I think I've heard you talking about puzzle pieces and looking for how it fits really well with another business and you can maximize that exit value. But it really comes down to, why do you want to do this? What's motivating you?
And if you're financial, like if you have a particular, it's very different. If you're running a company right now that's, say, $20 million, it's putting 3.5 to the bottom line, right? Like, how you value and do that one is very different than, an $80 million company that's, putting, say, only $4 million to bottom line. Profits are not that different, but the underlying mechanics are massively different in terms of, well, where are we going to see valuation? Where is the market going to be for this? What kind of company is going to buy this thing? Those can be dramatically different. And depending on which general route we're going to go down, we may want to focus on different kind of changes and growth objectives around for the company in the short term.
So I'm come to you. I'm all excited. I'm thinking of
Yeah.
selling the business, and we go through the why, and we uncover that why. I guess almost a step before that. What are some of the factors that business owners need to kind of be on the lookout for at the moment? I feel like there's a lot more activity in the market than there was maybe a decade ago. There's a lot more talk about acquisition entrepreneurship, and
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw a post on LinkedIn today, which no, in fact, I think it was an interview with John Warrillow where a business owner
Yeah.
had kind of been through a situation where the whole deal fell through because the acquirer was essentially didn't have the capital to do the acquisition at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
what are some of the things we should be watching out for as business owners?
Well, I would think about there's the internal things like what do we need to do internally to be ready for a transaction and maximize that transaction. Then there's the okay, who am I going to sell to, and how do I evaluate and basically assess the quality of a potential buyer, and who do I want to kind of start that process with, because it's a complicated, it's a very costly, it's a very distracting process. And the fact is you may have to go through 2 or 3 attempts before you get to a successful sale. So I wouldn't say I would set expectations accordingly, and we need to kind of bake that into the plan a little bit in terms of how we're going to do this. And we certainly don't want to be in a situation where we have to sell, because that's going to remove all leverage and all ability to maximize anything, right? You're basically going to have to take whatever comes at you.
Yeah,
But I think I always start kind of internally, right? It's like, why do we want to sell? How do we want to sell? When do we want to sell? And those kind of begin to suggest what are the things we need to do to get ready for that,
yeah,
either in terms of, and I always distinguish between things that are going to drive valuation, right? Things that are going to make the financial interest, how interesting the company is financially to a potential buyer, what's going to increase or decrease that, right? So that's, everything from just kind of core profitability to risks around clients, key person risk, how well is a new owner going to be able to operate the company successfully? Things that I can do to kind of maximize that. And then there are going to be things that just help get a transaction done. So you can have actually a great company with great fundamentals, but if you can't tell the story, if you can't demonstrate that well to a potential buyer, they're going to have to factor in a certain amount of price uncertainty because of their uncertainty on really what's going on in the business. That's going to impact price. Whereas a company who is ready to tell the story, is ready to demonstrate the value that they have as a company, that will improve the ability of it to get sold. That will make it sellable. All right. They'll just, even if the fundamentals are the same, being able to tell the story and demonstrate to a buyer that this is really what is there and that their vision for the future is doable.
yeah.
It's much more likely to get the transaction done, and hopefully faster. Speed of transaction is one of the factors I think most people don't think enough about. Take the same valuation, same kind of terms of a deal, getting done in 3 months is immensely more valuable than one that takes 9 months.
And when you talk about being able to tell that story, is that telling the story of the vision for where the business is going? Is it about being able to tell the story in terms of kind of forecasts and history? So what we've managed to achieve consistently, yeah, and where we're going. But what do you mean by being able to tell the story?
So the thing there is going to be, it depends on the nature of the sale. If I'm doing what I would call a financial sale, meaning I'm a buyer who's primarily a financial buyer, they're looking at this as a financial investment. I put X amount of capital in. It should generate some kind of return over some period of time. That's I call that a financial exit. A strategic exit is where the buyer sees the underlying assets and the capabilities of the company as valuable in some unique, interesting way that they can leverage to create some value, but may not be obvious or not directly related to the current execution or operations of the business. So the classic or the and they can be somewhat of a blend, but a pure financial private equity firm is more or less going to look at this as financial,
Yeah.
right? They're going to say, hey, look, we put this money in, we leverage it with debt, we kind of get a return over the next 3 to 5 years. We can, but in that case, I need to tell the story of the continued performance and growth of the company that I'm currently operating. I need to be able to say, hey, look, over the last 3 to 5 years, we've set these targets, we've developed these strategies, we've executed on these successfully. We see the market, we can approach the market, we can execute on the market and successfully grow and scale profitably. In those cases, I want to be able to tell a story of continued growth, right? We have enough TAM, like we have total addressable market that we still have room here to grow. We know that the strategies that we have are successful. We can continue to grow. We can anticipate some of the growth challenges that we're going to have in terms of entering new markets, geographies. We have demonstrated expertise and be able to do that. One of the ones we often look like on a financial side is does the net margin continue to grow at a minimum, maintain stability, ideally grow, meaning that as we scale the company, the efficiency of our fixed capital, of our fixed assets, continues to get leveraged. One of the most difficult things to try to sell, or one of the things that can get tripped up on, is like, yeah, we're growing. Like we're at $10 million, we were at 20% margin, and then we grew to $50 million. Well, now we're only a 15% margin. Anyone who's thinking about growth is going to be like, wait a minute here, right? Like, your margins are decreasing with scale. That's not what we want. Because then I'm looking at this, well, I make this a $200 million company. Am I going to be at a 2% margin? Right. The profit will be big, but profitability is going down. So I need to be able to tell that story on the financial side, that profitability at minimum will stay the same, ideally increase with scale. Like I got to be able to tell that for a financial buyer. Yeah. And then all the other things that a financial buyer is going to be worried about in terms of risks, key person risk, client risk, things like that a financial buyer would look at. A strategic, and it can be kind of a challenge because we don't know sometimes what a strategic is interested in. I'd say one of the key things about developing a strategy for a sale, particularly a strategic sale, is really understanding how that buyer is calculating value or seeing value. It might be your client list. It might be they're just buying you for a bunch of client relationships because they've got products and services that they can immediately start selling these folks that would generate huge amounts of revenue and huge amounts of profit that have nothing to do with your products or services. Or vice versa. They may want your underlying product or service or IP. They've got, you may have 200 clients. Well, they've got 2,000 clients in this space or an adjacent space that they can immediately resell all these things to and generate huge amounts of profits and revenue around. And so if we're in a strategic, the more that you can kind of understand where they're going to generate, where they see the potential value, and you can really highlight how your business could execute on that, or could be a key, that jigsaw puzzle piece, that missing piece in creating that map is key. We can talk a little bit about the Rembrandts in the attic if you want, and kind of that story, but it's a key one on that side of the business.
Yeah. And that Rembrandt and attic scenario is basically there's something up and makes a house a hell of a lot more valuable than if there wasn't something. But it's trying. Yeah,
well, I have a twist to it. I tell a slightly more complicated or sophisticated, how you want to look at it, Rembrandts in the attic story. And that the basic story is that yes, there a bunch of buyers go into a house and they find a painting in the attic that's extraordinarily valuable. So all of a sudden now, the value of the house is really not about the house; it's the painting and the thing that you can do with it. I tell a story. I tell a version of that. Of said one of the buyers happens to own 2 of the other paintings that are in that series. Like this would complete the series for them. Whereas the other buyers say, yeah, that painting is valuable, and they'll say it's a $20 million painting on its own. Yeah, they're going to bid up the house because they know there's a $20 million asset that's unrealized in there. The buyer that already has the 2, that it might be worth $50 million to them. Right. So now no one can compete with that person because no one could realize $50 million. They could only generate 20 on the open market. Whereas this one is like, I now have the set. That's what you want. You want to find these situations where you are the missing link in the thing that they're trying to solve. And that's where you create the you name your price at that
That's
point.
going to exponentially drive up the value of the
Yeah.
business. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But now the trick is being able to find that, or to understand that what needs to be done, or on the sort of financial side, making sure that the house is in order, and that you can sell that future, you can sell the
Yeah.
margins that are going to grow, which business owners, we're probably not really that good at.
Yeah.
We've got big egos as well. I guess when you walk into a room full of VC folk, or private equity folks, they do this day in and day out, and we kind of win at the game that we play as business owners, and we think that we can kind of keep beating the same level.
Yeah. It depends on where they are in the business. I'm going to say, like, certainly if they're early stage, right, their first couple of years, and they really need to grow for a while, right? Like, I'm not trying to, I mean, something like a data room, I'd say, like, okay, let's get a data room. It's easy to do. It's going to save us huge amounts of energy later. It actually drives some kind of efficiencies in the short term, right? Great. But there's other things. I'm like, just don't worry about this stuff right now. Like, let's just scale the business for a couple of years. And then, when we're 2 or 3 years away from feeling, okay, now we really want to do a transaction, we'll start putting that stuff through it. Right. Another one that it's a classic one is, owners who, are passing lots of money through the business.
Yeah.
Right. They're putting their cars, they're putting, all sorts of travel, things like that. And yeah, they're saving a whole bunch of money on taxes, but they're destroying their profitability, right? Because they don't want profitability, right? Because they don't want to have the tax liability. I get it. I understand it. We could debate the moral, ethical aspects of that, but that happens a lot. The problem comes is when you go to exit, like, that's going to hurt you, right? Because now you've got to, what we call, normalize your financials, right? You've got to show to a potential buyer, it's like, oh yeah, like, I know we're passing, there's like $200,000 of pass-through expenses I'm putting on the company, which is really profit. Like, we wouldn't do if this was, you wouldn't need to do. So I want that as credit for profit.
Yeah.
And now you gotta tell this ugly story, right? They gotta, like, okay, and you'll never get 100%. Maybe you'll get 50% of that. Like, if I'm a buyer, I'm going to push you on it. Like, I'm not going to just give you $100,000 of extra profit, right? Maybe I'll give you half of it, but every dollar of profit, if you're dealing with the high, multiple transaction, that could be worth $10 of value. So, the question is when as an owner do you not pass through these expenses? You say save 40 cents on taxes. Well, that dollar, if you just paid the taxes on it, it's going to be worth $10 in valuation.
Come exit.
Yeah, come exit. So, but you got to decide when you're going to make that flip, right? Like, saving 40% on things for 10 years might be worth it, and then years 4, 5, and 6 before exit, undo it and pass it through and pay the taxes, because you're gonna reap the benefit on the other side. As I would say, as long as I would say 3 years before, all right, you'd start that process. Like, generally, they're going to look back at least 3 years on your financials, maybe 5 in some cases. But if you're able to do that kind of in that window pre-exit, you're going to have a much better chance of getting the valuations than if you have all these expenses passing through the company. So that's a classic one. It's like, where are you in this? Maybe we keep doing that for now because we really don't think we're going to exit anytime soon. In other cases, like, all right, we need to start doing things like that if we're now within this 2 to 3 year pre-exit window.
Well, what sort of percentage of business owners are coming to you and saying, I want to exit, and I want to exit in the next 6 months, versus, I got the 3 years, I got the 3 years of energy, or whatever it is?
I would say, the buckets that I run into, there's a lot of companies come to me and we're, looking at growth and profitability, and, hey, I want to expand, or I really need to kind of clean up, how efficient we are as a business. We're generating a lot of revenue. We're not generating a lot of profit, or we're struggling with growth. We need to figure out where we're going to generate more revenue. In those cases, they're typically not really thinking about exit, at least not formally. And I would say in half of those cases, we do want to think about some, like, where are we going to exit potentially, and how do we want to align some of these decisions? In other cases, we're like, okay, let's just stabilize and kind of grow some things in the next year or two, and then we'll start to think about that stuff. Then there's a bucket of companies that are, I'm thinking about exiting it. So this is now a topic that I'm grappling with or planning for, usually over the next 3 to 5 years, right? Okay. So it's not tomorrow, but they're feeling like there's probably things they need to start doing to get ready for it. And sometimes it's externally driven. It's like, okay, I'm of an age, or, sometimes it's life. Like my kids are graduating, or, are going into college, or, there's some kind of life stage kind of thing where they want to have some options. Sometimes it's more personal. It's like, hey, I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm kind of burned out and I want to do something else. The companies that come to me are like, usually the companies that come to me are like, I've got to sell in 6 months, is because there's some external, really significant external event, or they've tried certain things. They have to just sort of get rid of the asset in some way, or they've got something else they want to do. And in those cases, we're just doing a cleanup and finding the best option. And sometimes we're finding a competitor to take over the business, and it might not actually be like any cash up front or any cash on transaction. It's going to be all, okay, you get a cut of revenues, or you get a cut of collectibles, or like, depending on how severe the situation is, like it may be just hey, let's find this a new home and tuck this into something. And, it's more about reducing complexity than it's about financial maximizing.
I imagine even those folks are in a space where the business is potentially sort of slightly distressed, have an idea of what their number is. How should business owners be approaching this, like figuring out what that number is for the business? Because I think it could be very inflated numbers. You could go to a broker, I suppose, and get a number. How do you figure out something reliable there?
Well, there's two. I mean, so I usually start with a combination of what do you want and why.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so it might be, I don't know, I've always thought about, being able to pocket $10 million, right? Okay, so let's start with there. Like, we figure out why. Like, okay, what does it come from? What is it satisfying about that or not? And then I'll usually kind of go through this thing of, okay, what about 9? What about 8? What about 7? Right? like where are they? And then, at some point they're like, oh yeah, no, I take that too. And at some point they're like, yeah. All right. So we kind of figure out like what their window is. But more importantly, it's like, what are the motivating factors? And is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? Is it like, it's just some number they picked? Or is this, well, no, I look at, I need this to fund X, Y, and Z, and I can get a X% return on this per year that would like give me a nice lifestyle or something, or I need X because I want to do something else. I want to roll this into another company, or I want to start this other thing, and I need, seed capital. So kind of understanding what is the deciding factors for them emotionally, logically, for their. So I always start there, and then we look at the business, and then I kind of go through a process of saying, okay, what is the business now? When are we going to sell? What percentage do you own? Like if we're going to scale this thing, if you're a $5 million company, we want to go to 50, we may have to take on some capital, or we may need to bring on partners, or we need to maybe give some capital or some equity to the leadership team, right? Like, so this is what do we think we're going to own at exit, valuation. And then we kind of reverse engineer, what do we need to grow per year, right? So it's based on where you are now, where you want to be. If you want to do this in 5 years, all right, we're looking at a 38% annual growth. It's like, okay, yeah, that's pretty doable. If you comes down and it's 178% annual growth, I'm like, tough to do 5 years, year over year.
Yeah.
So then either we need to change the time frame, we need to change the expectation, we need to change some of the growth strategies, right? Maybe we need to go from, a very service-based business to more of a product-based business, has much better multiples. Like having a sense of what's in their head first, and then we analyze the business and figure out what that delta is usually how I kind of initiate that conversation.
So there must be a mental shift that the owner has to go through. And I guess going back to what you were saying earlier about putting whatever expenses through a business and almost running it as a personal ATM, to being more intentional about the decisions you're making and almost putting them through a filter to say, well, if I want to sell this business and I want to sell it for 9 million, this is how I'm going to have to kind of shift my mindset. And that must be a very difficult, if you've been doing this for 20 years, kind of shift to getting to a place where you're actually being more intentional about not saving that 40 cents or whatever it was.
Or it could be, usually, oftentimes it's an investment issue. It's like, well, if we really want to grow that rate, we've got to invest in sales and marketing. We have to invest in hiring some senior level people. We've got to, really think about some other geographies, right? Like we're going to have to, oftentimes it's kind of this, I want to get these valuations. I want to put this money in my pocket. But in order to get there, I've got to actually start spending some money. And I've used this as a cash cow. Like, we got to decide whether or not you can make that mental shift, whether you're going to be able to take that risk and actually do those investments or not. That's probably where I run into more challenges, or there's more kind of honest discussions around. Well, you have a choice. If you want to put 50 million in your pocket, then we're going to have to be really kind of grow and scale in these ways, and maybe transform the company to be able to get these valuations. That's going to come with some spending and certainly some risk. Or do you want to put 10 million in your pocket, which we could just incrementally grow the current business? It's going to be a very different valuation, and the final number is going to be but maybe that's actually much more doable for you because it's more like 10 million, pretty easy in the pocket, and don't have to change a lot of other things in your life and how you're approaching it. Or if you want to get the 50, then we're going to have to take some risks. That may not be worth it. It may not.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's like, oh, that's $40 million. Like, why would it not be $40 million? It may not be. Right.
Yeah, it may not pay off in the end.
The risk, I mean, there's obviously risk there, but for one, would they look at, okay, what can I do personally? It's kind of an existential question, right? Existential question. I mean, there's always this, like, how happy are you? And how much more happy is $40 million going to be? And for some people, it is. Some people are like, what I can do, and I'll be honest, I mean, a lot of times it's not like, oh, well, I can drive that much nicer of a car. People are driving really nice cars, right? Like the incremental, going from $100,000 BMW kind of thing to, a $500,000 McLaren. It's like, there's not for most people, unless like you're some freak car nut kind of thing, the incremental happiness with that purchase is not there. Usually what it has to do with some kind of impact they can have on something other than themselves. Sometimes it's about family and leaving a legacy. Sometimes it's about community, right? And what they can do for geographic area or whatever community they're involved in. It could be a community or a organization or something they want to be able to do, or like, being able to leave a legacy of education, and, they want to donate to their school or create a hospital, or like, oftentimes it ends up becoming those kind of things. It's like, and then they're motivated in doing it. But money for money's sake is tough to, usually not enough of a driver for people to take the big risks that they need to take to do that kind of growth.
Yeah. I mean, so I wanted to go back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, and this idea of getting the right team or the right people around you.
Yeah.
I think before we started, I was telling you that I kind of went it alone when I did my exit, and I remember sitting with a lawyer a few times, and he said, "Why do you never come to me before you do any of these things?" Not again. But when's the right time to start assembling this team? And what should that team look like?
Yeah. So, and maybe I'll split the internal team versus the external team. I think internal team, again, it somewhat goes to how you're going to exit. If you're going to do a financial exit, the buyer is probably, in many cases, I don't know if I'd say most, but many cases, they're going to expect you to continue to run the company in some capacity. They're not going to bring management. In some cases, they're bringing a portfolio company, or maybe there's a platform they've already created, and they're going to tuck you in, and maybe they've got senior leadership, and you just need kind of domain leadership or something. But if you are going to do a financial exit, and one of your goals of doing an exit is so that you don't have to work in the company anymore, like, we need to do some planning, because we need to get a leadership team in place that's going to be able to continue to run the company without you. And we need to get them up and running. They need to be capable and have shown the ability to do that for some period of time before you sell. So that can lead to nasty situations of people selling the company thinking, oh, great, I've got all this cash and I can do all these things. But they're like, oh my gosh, now I'm just a slave to my earnout. Yeah. And, that can be a horrible situation. So think about the internal team. What internal team do I need to put together is going to be based on what I want my exit to look like. What is the nature of that exit? And if part of my exit is going to be, I'm going to reduce my involvement in the company, maybe 100%. I need to figure out, okay, what happens with the company? So there's the internal team stuff. The external team is going to be, I would say, again, somewhat dependent on the nature of the exit. But I want people who are going to help ask the right questions so that I know what decisions I really need to make. And the two problems that I find is that people hire someone that is designed or it is used for a particular type of exit, but that may not be the type of exit they really should be doing. And so now they're kind of committing down a path. You hire an investment banker,
Yeah.
and okay, that's a particular type of exit and a particular type of process. You are now down that track, and whether or not that's the right track for you, or maybe it's even not the right timing for you, like that's going to put you down a path that might be challenging or might cause stress and friction.
Because that person's got their own agenda or their own
Yeah,
approach or whatever. Yeah.
and they want to, they're transaction based, right? They want to
Yeah.
get this thing sold in the next 6 to 9 months. And if you're not really ready to sell in this next 6 to 9 months, you're going to fight. You're going to have friction. A lawyer, right, is very much based on the transaction. Again, somewhat based on the transaction or the type of transaction. I would hire a slightly different type of lawyer based on how I'm doing, what kind of deal. So again, if you hire them too early, they're going to make assumptions, or they're like, hey, this is what I do, so we're going to put you down this path that may or may not right the situation. Wealth managers are usually another one that people go to for this stuff. They're really helpful in terms of figuring out tax efficiency and where am I going to park this money or invest this money in most efficient ways based on my overall outcome. They typically are not very knowledgeable of more the strategic side of the different kinds of exits, certainly prepping the company in terms of valuation and making it viable. So I think of these phases as sort of stabilizing the company, or kind of growing and stabilizing the company, then kind of thinking through what type of exit might I want to be considering and what kind of time frame. And once I have that, then I start to put together key pieces of the deal team as I move, I would say, for the 24 to 36 months prior to when I think I might want to exit. Yeah. I start putting some of these more deal team specific people in place. So investment bankers, lawyers, accountants, and they are going to help me kind of get ready for it. But it's a little bit of, once we start bringing them in, we're on some kind of time frame for when a made transaction.
Is that something I'm thinking about myself, or is there that first person you bring on board to help you kind of navigate this process if there are these nuances to how you assemble?
Not to be self-promotional, but this is why I've kind of gotten into this space, because I think this is the challenge is asking the questions and figuring out the time frame and figuring out kind of when to bring some of these folks on is part of the difficult process, or it's tough to kind of decide. And there's a little bit, once I bring some of these people on, I'm now down. The train is leaving the station and I'm now in a bit of a process. I'm coming out of the kind of strategy and growth phase where like we could do that for the next 10 years, but at some point we may start to want to start that process of some kind of exit planning process. And what I find is, given that I've worked with the team, I've worked with the founders, I've worked with the leadership team, I know the business, there's a certain amount of every quarter we can kind of check in on that question and start to, okay, like probably next year we need to start that process. Maybe it's next quarter, right? Like we can start figuring out. And then depending on the nature of the exit, so if we're going to go financial, probably looking at some kind of private equity kind of deal, that leads us to a certain kind of investment bankers and folks that are going to help us on that route. If it's going to be more strategic, then we start looking at actually developing strategies, exit strategies, and potentially finding people that are more specific to some of these industries that we think we have opportunity. Yeah. We think we have opportunities around. The lawyers, a good lawyer I would bring in sooner rather than later, but their transaction. Like I really don't get them involved until we have a pretty good sense of what transaction we're probably looking at. Accountant is probably one I would bring in earlier, and there's a difference between my tax accountant and operational accountant, people that kind of run my business. At some point you want to bring in someone who's more of a CFO, deal accountant, who's going to help do things like quality of earnings reports. It's going to start being able to pull the data out of the company that is going to be specifically used for transaction purposes. Now, we may need to bring them a couple years before because we need to start of setting up the books, or we need to set up our reports such that we've got several years of good financials that are going to tell the story. It goes back to this tell the story idea. But can also kind of do the stuff. I think this kind of goes to how viable this company is. If I've got quality of earnings, if I've got audited financials, ideally, and not that we always need audited financials. It really depends on the nature or size of the company and the nature of the sale. But certainly things like quality of earnings reports, some type of rigorous looking at the financials, right? That's, a buyer's just gonna be, okay, great. It's going to take weeks off my due diligence process, because otherwise they're essentially going to have to do this retroactively. And that's what is expensive and difficult to do in a transaction.
I imagine you're also setting yourself up to kind of build some trust as well. So when a buyer or acquirer walks in and you are well prepared and you've done that work up front,
it's all trust. I mean, if you think about it, you've got a buyer coming in and within, sometimes within, 2 or 3 months is making a decision to invest a huge amount of capital into this business. And it's all intangibles, right? I mean, maybe you have inventory or something, you could actually look at some product, but otherwise they're buying customer relationships, they're buying contracts, they're buying people, employees, they're buying goodwill, they're buying IP, processes. Like, it is all, they're having to make huge amounts of trust in the situation. And the more that I can make it easier for them to trust the information that I'm giving them and trust me, the person giving it to them, the easier it's going to make the transaction. One of the things, another conversation I have very quickly, certain in general, but certainly if we're dealing with hey, I want to sell this company at some point here, is I'll ask, okay, well, let's go through all the skeletons.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do it now. Right.
Get them out of the closet.
That lawsuit that you have, that, disgruntled employee, that, tax you didn't file, that, whatever, get it all on the table. And if we're in closer transaction, we're going to start a transaction conversation. Like, we give it all to them right away. We just literally give them in hiring. We talk about the anti-resume, right? So the resume is all the wonderful accomplishments I have as a professional. The anti-resume is all the ways I fucked up as a professional, and I love that. I'll do this with teams where we have them present their anti-resume kind of thing. Well, I do that with a company. It's like, okay, let's just, because if we can get it all out and then there's no other shoes that are going to drop, a buyer is going to be, okay, thank you. Right. Because now we can deal with it. Like, now I know all the warts and I know all the issues. And if I give them all that information and it's honest, it's upfront, we have a plan for dealing with it, and nothing else comes up as and there's this other thing. It's like the moment there's this other thing we didn't tell you about. That's where buyers are just like, okay, now I'm having to put millions of dollars in escrow, because I've got to de-risk the situation. The only way to do it, or I reduce the valuation, right? Or I have all these nasty representations of warranties and indemnifications in the contracts because, I don't want to buy this. I don't want to buy this problem. I want to buy
do
success.
That stuff up front.
Yeah, do it all up front. Get it all. Yeah. I mean, ideally clean it up. I mean, I try to, let's get it up and let's clean it up before we actually go into transaction. Yeah. But I don't know, like, we've got a key client risk, put it on the table and put a strategy on saying, hey, look, we're good. The problem comes is, hey, I've got a key client risk. And then you're like, yeah, but I've known this, they're my high school buddy, right? Like, they'd never cancel it. And the buyer's going to be like, yeah, but you're leaving. They might cancel it on me, right? That's de-risk for you, but it's not de-risk for me as a buyer.
Yeah.
So I've got to think through, like, how do I de-risk this stuff for buyers?
So what's a few pieces of advice that you'd give to a business owner now who's thinking about transition or succession?
Yeah. So, I mean, I go to the first thing is why. Like, what is motivating you right now? Is it fear? Is it opportunity? Is it, legacy? Like gets clear on what are the motivating factors. What are these kind of, like, what do you really want and need out of the transaction? Like, how do you want it to play out? Like, why does it need to be in 2 years? Why? Okay, maybe that's true. Maybe not. Maybe it's you're burned out, but maybe there's we can change your role. We can figure out some other people to bring in. Maybe you can do another 5 years without an issue as long as we change these things. So it's really getting into the why and the when. And then we get into kind of mechanics, and I've got all sorts of checklists around, okay, things that typically detract from valuation, things that typically enhance valuation, and we can start going through those. And honestly, we're not going to get to all of them, but we can assess and figure out where are the big moves we can make, or like where are the big factors that we can actually start addressing inside the company, as much preparation we can get. And then once we're in that kind of 12 to 24 months or 12 to 36 months, 2 to 3 years out from when we think we'd like to have a transaction, then we start doing more formal planning and getting the company tuned. I'm not a big fan of trying to time transactions, but there are things we can do to kind of tune the company a little bit for valuation and for transaction.
What about life after an exit? Did you go through any kind of depression, in terms of this planning process, or any kind of like loss of purpose when you sold? Or
yeah, I mean, because I think I was a little late. Like I for me, it was kind of like, okay, good. Like I'm
done.
Like I don't have this burden. Like it very much felt like a burden the last year or two. And so initially, I think there was this big relief, and then you kind of have this existential crisis of, what do I do now? And partly because like I was not, like, I didn't have professional goals to be a CEO, and I wasn't like, okay, I'm going to go be a CEO again. Like it certainly was like, I don't know, like I could do a lot of different things, which was an opportunity to some extent because I could consider lots of different options. It was problematic otherwise because it's like, okay, I would decide. But I think I always like to start, well before we're at transaction of really kind of planning out how is this going to be a springboard to whatever they're going to do next. Whether, personal, professional, are they, start another company? Are they going to open a family office? Are they going to, focus on other aspects of their lives? I mean, maybe they're sort of retired professionally, but there are other endeavors. Maybe they want to travel with their family for a couple of years, or,
so think about what that next chapter is.
What is the next chapter? And there's got to be, it depends on where they are in life and as well, right? Like, their late 30s is like, okay, you've got another 30 years of like professional career that we need to figure out. But we need to kind of figure out what the plan is. What's the motive? I talk about pull. Like we want to have something that's going to pull them through the transaction to get to wherever they want to be. Otherwise, there's going to find all sorts of ways to sabotage, the process, because they're afraid. Ultimately, they're afraid. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to want to. This is familiar. I know I can do this. Why do I want to give this up? Even if consciously they want to sell, subconsciously they're going to be like, why am I doing this? So having some kind of plan, professional, personal plan. The other one too is like, I mean, I do a lot of kind of assessing how is it going to impact their lives, because, for them, these are life-changing. These can be, very life-changing events, but oftentimes for their family and friends, it's not, right? There's still a thing. One case where someone's like, yeah, we're going to buy a sailboat and we're going to, sail the world for a year and everything. The wife was like, with who are you going on the sailboat with? Right? Like, it's not me, right? Like I have got a job, I've got a career. Like I'm not giving up my stuff just so they get very like, this is going to change my life. But they're like, okay, but not the lives of everyone else. I mean, it's going to change their lives too, right? Particularly if if you got a significant amount of money, that is going to change things, but not in the way that you think, right? It's not, it's hugely impactful for you. Everyone else, it's sort of derivative. So thinking through that and really kind of how do I manage that and how do I plan for that and how do I not get ahead of myself?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes that's the challenge. It's like, oh my God, I had this life-changing event. And then everyone's like, but no one else has changed. Yeah. Now I'm sitting at home because like, I don't know, everyone else went to work for the day and I didn't go to work for the day. And what do I do? Right? I gotta pop a bottle of wine at 10:30 in the morning. It's like, okay, we're going to have a problem.
So think through it, have those conversations early. And okay. You love vinyl.
Oh yeah.
You've been doing some coaching for vinyl.
Yeah, I started that about a year ago where I kind of got into music, and then some friends were sending me some things. Then I was like, okay, well, I'll give you a coaching. You send me some vinyl. Let's talk about your challenge. And then I flipped around and was like, okay, now people before it's like, I'll do a call with you. It's like, okay, but you got to send me a vinyl.
So what's a piece of vinyl you're looking for at the moment?
Oh, well, I've got an Amazon wish list that I publish.
We'll put that in the
I'll send that in the show notes. It's a mix of classic rock. I've been really getting into vocalists. Fiasco Lupe was one that I came up with recently, and it's an interesting kind of genre of more kind of R&B and rap and things like that. But it's great on vinyl because of the voice quality. A really good vocalist is really good, and it picks up great on vinyl. So I've been playing around with some of that genre. But yeah, I'm kind of open ended.
Awesome. Let's get that into the show notes. One last closing question.
Yeah.
Like the name of the podcast is The Freedom Experience. What does freedom mean to you, Bruce?
Well, I always say, freedom is choice, right?
Yeah.
If you have choices, you have freedom. If you
Yeah.
don't have a lot of choices, you don't have a lot of freedom. And that could look very different than for different people, it can look very differently. But if you feel like you have choice, that may not take a lot of money, right? As long as you feel like you have choice. For other people, it takes a lot of money because what they want to choose between is expensive.
Yeah. So it's about making the choices and kind of shaping your life around it. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.